a small tyrannosaur walked out of the rocks, and for decades it refused to stay in one box. Was it a lost predator, a fast little cousin of Tyrannosaurus rex, sharing the last Cretaceous forests with the king of dinosaurs? Or was it something even stranger, a teenage T-Rex, not yet swollen into the giant skull, thick teeth, and crushing body that made the adult animal famous? That question sounds narrow at first. One fossil name, one taxonomic argument, one small-bodied tyrannosaur from the same rocks that gave the world T-Rex. But the Nanotyrannus debate became much bigger than a name. It became a fight over how dinosaurs grew, how many predators lived in the Hell Creek ecosystem, how paleontologists read bones, and how easy it is to mistake age for species when all you have are fossils. And it changed the way people talk about T-Rex. Because if Nanotyrannus was just a juvenile T-Rex, then the most famous predator in history had a strange life story. It began as a long-legged, narrow-snouted, relatively agile hunter with more blade-like teeth, then transformed into a heavy adult skull crusher with massive jaws and bone-cracking teeth. That version of T-Rex is fascinating. It makes the animal almost two predators in one lifetime: a fast mid-sized hunter when young, and a gigantic apex predator when mature. But if Nanotyrannus was real, if it was not a teenage T-Rex, then the picture changes again. Then the late Cretaceous was not simply ruled by one tyrant at different ages. It may have held more tyrannosaur diversity than many scientists thought. T-Rex may have shared its world with smaller, faster adult tyrannosaurs hunting in overlapping spaces, competing with young tyrants, and filling predator roles that once seemed to belong to juvenile T-Rex alone. That is why this debate matters. It is not just a fight over a skull in a museum drawer. It is a fight over the final predator community before the asteroid. It asks whether the last dinosaur ecosystems were simpler than earlier ones, dominated by one giant species, or whether they were more crowded, more complex, and more surprising. It asks how we tell the difference between a young animal and a different kind of animal. It asks how much confidence we should have when a fossil looks like a miniature version of something famous. And it asks one of the most dangerous questions in paleontology. Are we seeing evolution, or are we seeing growth? The story begins with a skull. In the middle of the 20th century, a small Tyrannosaur skull from the late Cretaceous rocks of Montana became part of the scientific puzzle. It was not gigantic like the most famous T-Rex skulls. It was narrower, lighter, and more delicate. It had more teeth. It looked Tyrannosaur-like, but not exactly like the adult tyrant everyone knew. Over time, this skull became associated with the name Nanotyrannus lancensis, a name that almost sounds like a headline by itself: the tiny tyrant. The problem was obvious from the beginning. A small tyrannosaur could mean at least two very different things. It could be a small adult species, or it could be a young individual of a giant species. In living animals, that problem can sometimes be solved by watching them grow. You can follow a population through time. You can compare babies, juveniles, subadults, and adults. You can observe behavior, reproduction, and development. Fossils do not give you that luxury. They give you scattered bones from animals that died at different ages, in different places, preserved with different degrees of completeness. You have to build a growth series from death, and death is a messy archive. A juvenile animal can look like a different species. Its skull proportions may differ. Its limbs may be longer relative to its body. Its teeth may change shape. Its bones may not yet be fused. Its surface texture may be immature. It may occupy a different ecological role than the adult. In dinosaurs, this can be especially tricky because many species changed dramatically as they grew. So for years, many paleontologists looked at Nanotyrannus and saw not a separate species, but a young T-Rex. That idea made sense in several ways. T-Rex is common in the Hell Creek and Lance formations compared with many large theropods. But very young and teenage T-Rex fossils are rarer than adult fossils. If small tyrannosaurs from those rocks were actually juvenile T-Rex, that helped fill a missing chapter in the life history of the world's most famous dinosaur. It also explained why these animals were found in the same time and place as T-Rex. They were not neighbors, they were the same species at different ages. The juvenile T-Rex hypothesis became powerful because it fit a bigger story. T-Rex adults were massive, deep-skulled, bone-crushing predators. Young T-Rex, under this model, were more slender and agile. They had narrower skulls, longer limbs, and more blade-like teeth. They may have chased smaller prey that adult T-Rex did not specialize in catching. As they grew, their bodies shifted, their skulls deepened, their bite forces increased, their teeth thickened, their role in the ecosystem changed. That is a beautiful idea. It makes T-Rex even more impressive. It turns the animal into an ecological shapeshifter. A juvenile might behave almost like a different predator, while the adult becomes the heavyweight tyrant. Many paleontologists liked this interpretation because it made sense of the fossils and gave T-Rex a dramatic growth story. But not everyone agreed. Supporters of Nanotyrannus as a real genus argued that the differences were too strong, too consistent, and too biologically strange to explain as simple growth. They pointed to tooth counts, skull anatomy, limb proportions, and other details. They argued that juvenile T-Rex fossils do exist and show diagnostic features of Tyrannosaur, while Nanotyrannus shows its own distinctive pattern. They said the small skull was not merely an immature version of the king, but evidence of another predator hiding in plain sight. For decades, the debate moved back and forth, and part of what made it so difficult was that both sides could make reasonable arguments from incomplete material. That is the thing about paleontology that popular headlines often miss. Scientists are not usually arguing because one side has evidence and the other has none. They are arguing because fossils are incomplete, because development is complicated, because anatomy can be interpreted in multiple ways, and because one new specimen can change the weight of everything that came before. The Nanotyrannus debate needed better fossils. It needed more than a skull. It needed a skeleton. That is why the Dueling Dinosaurs specimen became so important. The Dueling Dinosaurs fossil is one of those discoveries that seems almost too cinematic to be real. It contains a Triceratops and a small-bodied Tyrannosaur preserved together, in a way that has invited endless speculation about whether they were locked in combat, buried after a fight, or associated by a more complicated set of events. Whatever the exact death story, the fossil became legendary because of its preservation and drama. For years, though, the specimen was not fully available to science in the way researchers needed. It passed through a complicated history involving private discovery, commercial fossil markets, legal and ownership issues, and eventually acquisition by the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. Once it became accessible for detailed study, paleontologists had something the Nanotyrannus debate had long needed: an exceptionally complete small tyrannosaur from the right rocks, with enough anatomy to test the competing hypotheses more seriously. That is why the recent research attracted so much attention. The claim was not simply, here is another small tyrannosaur. The claim was that the Dueling Dinosaurs tyrannosaur was a mature Nanotyrannus lancensis, not a teenage T-Rex. Researchers pointed to growth evidence, skeletal maturity, and anatomical traits that they argued were incompatible with the animal being a juvenile Tyrannosaurus rex. They described differences in tooth count, forelimb proportions, tail anatomy, skull nerves and sinuses, and other skeletal features. They argued that these were not just features waiting to transform into adult T-Rex anatomy. This is the kind of evidence that can shift the debate. Growth rings are especially important. Dinosaur bones, like the bones of many animals, can record growth history in microscopic structure. Lines of arrested growth, sometimes compared loosely to tree rings, can show changes in growth over time. They can help scientists estimate whether an animal was growing rapidly, slowing down, or approaching maturity. If a small tyrannosaur is very young and still growing quickly, that supports the juvenile hypothesis. If it is near mature or mature while still small, that supports the distinct species hypothesis. But even here, caution matters. Growth lines are powerful evidence, not magic. They require careful sampling, comparison, and interpretation. Different bones can preserve growth records differently. Some bones are better than others. Growth rates vary among individuals and species. But when growth evidence lines up with skeletal fusion and anatomy, the case becomes stronger. That is what the new Nanotyrannus studies argued. They suggested that at least some small tyrannosaurs previously treated as teenage T-Rex were not teenage T-Rex at all. They were mature or near-mature animals belonging to Nanotyrannus. A later study focusing on the hyoid, a throat bone from the original Nanotyrannus specimen, added another line of evidence, reporting growth marks, indicating the animal was mature or near mature, rather than a young Tyrannosaurus. Together, those studies created what some researchers described as a one-two punch for the separate species case. But the strongest version of the argument still needs a careful sentence. It does not mean every small tyrannosaur fossil from the Hell Creek Formation is automatically Nanotyrannus. That would be a mistake. Some small tyrannosaurs likely are juvenile T-Rex. T-Rex had to have juveniles. Adult T-Rex did not appear from nowhere. Young tyrannosaurs existed, and the fossil record should preserve at least some of them. Even scientists persuaded that Nanotyrannus was real have warned against turning every small tyrannosaur into Nanotyrannus. The problem becomes more complicated, not less. Now, paleontologists may have to separate juvenile T-Rex from adult Nanotyrannus, and perhaps from more than one species of small tyrannosaur. That is not a simple job, because an adult Nanotyrannus and a teenage T-Rex could overlap in size. They lived in the same broad ecosystems. They were related predators with some similar features. If one is a small adult and the other is a young giant, the bones may look deceptively similar in some ways and sharply different in others. Paleontologists now have to ask a more refined question, not, is every small tyrannosaur a baby T-Rex? But which small tyrannosaur is which, and how can we tell? That is how science actually changes. Not by replacing one simplistic answer with another simplistic answer, but by making the question more precise. For a long time, the public version of the debate was easy to package. Nanotyrannus, real species or baby T-Rex. After the Dueling Dinosaurs research, the more mature version is, Nanotyrannus may be valid, but juvenile T-Rex also existed, and the challenge is to identify which specimens belong to which animal, how many small tyrannosaur taxa there were, and what that means for T-Rex growth studies built on older assumptions. That is less catchy. It is also more interesting. Because if Nanotyrannus really lived alongside T-Rex, then the Hell Creek ecosystem becomes more crowded and more dynamic. The late Cretaceous predator scene was not simply one tyrant at different sizes. It may have included adult T-Rex, subadult T-Rex, juvenile T-Rex, and adult Nanotyrannus occupying overlapping but distinct roles. Imagine a world where the top predator is a massive bone crusher, but medium-sized prey also face a faster, more lightly built tyrannosaur with a different hunting style. Now the ecosystem changes. The food web becomes sharper. Young T-Rex no longer automatically owns the mid-sized predator niche. It may have had competition. Nanotyrannus may have hunted different prey, used different strategies, or overlapped with young T-Rex in ways that made the ecosystem more complex. This matters because for years, some researchers suggested that late Cretaceous North America had relatively low large theropod diversity compared with earlier ecosystems. T-Rex, in that picture, dominated so completely that its young filled roles occupied by separate predator species in other ecosystems. Nanotyrannus challenges that picture. It suggests the final days of the dinosaurs may have had more tyrannosaur diversity than the simplified T-Rex-centered model allowed. The king of dinosaurs may still have been king, but it may not have been alone. That phrase is powerful. Not alone. T-Rex is so famous that it bends the public imagination around itself. When people picture Hell Creek, they often picture one predator, the king. Everything else becomes background. Triceratops, Edmontosaurus, Ankylosaurus, Pachycephalosaurus, small mammals, birds, crocodilians, turtles, plants, insects, rivers, floodplains. All of it becomes stage dressing for T-Rex. But real ecosystems are never built around one celebrity. They are networks. The Nanotyrannus debate is useful because it forces T-Rex out of isolation. It reminds us that even the most famous dinosaur was part of an ecosystem with competitors, prey, juveniles, scavengers, diseases, seasons, floods, fires, and other predators. If Nanotyrannus was there as a distinct adult animal, then T-Rex lived in a more complicated predator community than the popular image suggests. That does not make T-Rex less impressive. If anything, it makes the world around T-Rex more believable. A real king exists in a kingdom, not in an empty room. The debate also changes how we talk about T-Rex growth. If specimens once used to model teenage T-Rex actually belong to Nanotyrannus, then some past studies of T-Rex life history may need revision. That does not mean every study collapses. It means the sample needs rechecking. Paleontology often works this way. A specimen gets assigned to one taxon, used in growth curves, locomotion estimates, bite force studies, biomechanical models, or ecological interpretations. If the taxonomic assignment changes, the downstream interpretations may change too. This is why naming matters. Taxonomy can sound like bookkeeping. It is not. The name on a fossil determines what story the fossil tells. If a skeleton is a juvenile T-Rex, it tells us about how T-Rex grew. If it is an adult Nanotyrannus, it tells us about tyrannosaur diversity. Same bones, different story. That is why scientists can argue so intensely over names. A fossil name is not just a label. It is an interpretation. And Nanotyrannus has carried competing interpretations for decades. One side saw growth. Another side saw diversity. One side saw the teenage king. Another saw the lost predator. The Dueling Dinosaurs specimen gave the lost predator side its strongest modern evidence. But the story should not be told as T. Rex got debunked or everything we knew was wrong in the cheap headline sense. That kind of framing misses the beauty of the debate. T-Rex was not fake. Juvenile T-Rex were not imaginary. The real issue is that paleontologists may have grouped together animals that need to be separated more carefully. Some ideas about T-Rex growth may still hold. Some may need revision. Some small tyrannosaurs may be Nanotyrannus. Some may be juvenile T-Rex. The science is not becoming less interesting. It is becoming more detailed. That is a better story than a takedown. The king of dinosaurs did not fall. The kingdom got bigger. There is also a human side to this debate. Paleontologists care about evidence, but they also build careers around interpretations. A long-running controversy becomes part of the culture of a field. Scientists write papers, respond to papers, revise positions, hold on to skepticism, change their minds, or refuse to change until the evidence is overwhelming. That process can look messy from the outside, but it is how science works when the evidence is difficult. The Nanotyrannus story is a good example of why scientific disagreement should not automatically be dismissed as confusion. The disagreement existed because the fossils were hard. Juvenile versus species is genuinely difficult. Growth changes can mimic evolutionary differences. Fossil samples are incomplete. Commercial fossil histories can delay access. Some specimens are crushed, incomplete, or hard to compare. Methods improve over time. New material appears. A conclusion that was reasonable in 1999 may be challenged by evidence available in 2025. Science is not a museum of fixed answers. It is a method for surviving better evidence. That is why it matters when some researchers publicly shift their views. When a scientist who once considered small tyrannosaurs to be juvenile T-Rex says that new evidence has changed their thinking, that is not weakness. That is science doing what it is supposed to do. Changing your mind because the evidence changed is not embarrassing. It is the standard. But skepticism also remains valuable. Even after strong new evidence, scientists may still debate how many Nanotyrannus species existed, whether Jane belongs to a second Nanotyrannus species, how to classify fragmentary specimens, and where exactly Nanotyrannus fits in the Tyrannosaur family tree. These are not trivial details. They shape the larger picture of Tyrannosaur evolution. For example, Nanotyrannus lancensis is the name at the center of the debate. But some recent interpretations have suggested that the famous Jane specimen may represent a different species within Nanotyrannus. That idea is exciting, but it is also the kind of claim that needs careful testing. More species means more diversity, but paleontologists must avoid splitting fossils too quickly when variation, age, sex, individual differences, and preservation can complicate the picture. There is a danger on both sides. The lumping danger is that you call everything T. Rex growth and erase real diversity. The splitting danger is that you name too many species from variation that may not be species level. Good paleontology lives in the tension between those dangers. Nanotyrannus sits exactly in that tension. And that is why the debate became famous. It is not just about one animal. It is about how paleontologists decide what a species is in deep time. Modern species concepts do not map cleanly onto fossils. You cannot test whether Nanotyrannus and T. Rex interbred. You cannot watch their behavior. You cannot sequence complete genomes from most dinosaur fossils, at least not in the way we can with Ice Age mammals. You work with bones. You look for consistent anatomical differences, growth indicators, histology, proportions, phylogenetic relationships, and patterns across specimens. You ask whether the differences are best explained by age, sex, individual variation, pathology, or distinct taxonomy. That is detective work. But it is not detective work with a confession at the end. Fossils rarely confess. They sit there and force you to argue. The Dueling Dinosaurs Tyrannosaur is powerful because it gives paleontologists more of the body to argue from. More bones mean more characters, more growth evidence, more context. more tests of whether the animal was still growing rapidly or had reached skeletal maturity. A skull alone can mislead. A skeleton can still mislead, but it gives fewer places for a bad interpretation to hide. And that skeleton appears to say, this was not simply a baby T-Rex. If that conclusion holds, the implications ripple outward. First, T-Rex growth curves need to be re-examined. Which specimens truly belong to T-Rex? Which ones were borrowed from Nanotyrannus by mistake? How did real juvenile T-Rex grow? Did they still pass through a long-legged, slender phase? Probably yes, but perhaps not in exactly the way some models assumed. Second, predator diversity in Hell Creek needs rethinking. How did Nanotyrannus and T-Rex divide prey? Did adult Nanotyrannus compete most with juvenile T-Rex? Did they hunt smaller animals, faster animals, or different habitats? Did they scavenge from each other? Were they rare, common, or simply under-recognized? Third, museum interpretation changes. For years, some displays and public explanations treated Nanotyrannus-like specimens as teenage T-Rex. Museums may now need to update labels, growth charts, and educational narratives. That might sound small, but public understanding of dinosaurs is shaped by museum halls. A label can teach millions of people. Fourth, the public image of T-Rex becomes richer. Instead of one species occupying all tyrannosaur roles at all ages, we may need to picture a predator community. Young T-Rex were still dangerous. Adult T-Rex were still terrifying. But Nanotyrannus may have added another threat. Smaller than the king, but fully grown, agile, and built differently. That image is cinematic. A Hell Creek forest near the end of the Cretaceous. A young Edmontosaurus moving through cover. A teenage T-Rex somewhere nearby. A lighter Tyrannosaur, adult but not giant, moving faster through the brush. And farther back, the massive adult T-Rex. The animal whose skull alone announces a different kind of danger. Multiple tyrants in one world. That is a better documentary image than Baby or Not Baby. It gives the ecosystem teeth. But, again, the script has to stay honest. We should not turn Nanotyrannus into a monster just because the story is exciting. It was smaller than adult T-Rex. It did not overthrow T-Rex. It was not secretly the real king. It was likely one predator in a larger ecosystem. Its importance is not that it makes T-Rex weak. Its importance is that it makes the world of T-Rex more complex. The public loves dinosaur debates because they feel like prehistoric mysteries. Feathers or scales, lips or no lips, fast runner or slow walker, scavenger or hunter, baby T-Rex or Nanotyrannus. These questions work because dinosaurs are both scientific objects and cultural icons. People want them to be known, but they also love that they are not fully knowable. Every new fossil can shift the image. Nanotyrannus is a perfect example. It challenges the authority of the old picture without destroying the wonder. It reminds us that paleontology is not a finished book. Even the most famous dinosaur in the world still has unresolved chapters around it. We know T-Rex better than many dinosaurs, but we do not know everything. The king still has secrets, and maybe that is why this controversy caught fire. T-Rex feels like a settled icon. Everyone knows it. Everyone recognizes it. The skull, the tiny arms, the huge teeth, the name itself. Tyrannosaurus Rex is the brand name of prehistoric power. Nanotyrannus sneaks into that throne room and asks, what if some of what you thought was teenage T-Rex was actually someone else? That is not just a technical question. It feels like identity theft in reverse. For years, maybe Nanotyrannus bones were used to tell the life story of T-Rex. If the new evidence holds, then a small predator had been hidden inside the king's biography. The baby T-Rex in some stories may not have been the king as a teenager. It may have been a different animal with its own life, its own evolution, and its own role in the ecosystem. That is why the title Nanotyrannus Explained matters. The point is not just whether it was real. The point is that if it was real, we have to give it back its story. That story begins not as a rival trying to dethrone T-Rex, but as a reminder that fame distorts. T-Rex is so famous that smaller tyrannosaurs near it get pulled into its gravity. They become juveniles, side notes, growth stages. Nanotyrannus asks whether some of those fossils deserve to escape the gravity of the king. In a strange way, this is a story about paleontological humility. Do not assume a fossil belongs to the famous animal just because the famous animal is nearby. Do not assume small means young. Do not assume difference means species without testing growth. Do not assume one line of evidence can settle everything. Bones are complicated, and growth is one of the great tricksters of anatomy. That trickster has fooled paleontologists before. Dinosaurs often changed dramatically as they matured. Horned dinosaurs changed skull ornamentation. Duck-billed dinosaurs changed crests. Tyrannosaurs changed skull proportions. Some juvenile dinosaurs were once named as separate species before later being recognized as growth stages. Other times, fossils were lumped too aggressively, hiding real diversity. The history of dinosaur taxonomy is full of corrections in both directions. Nanotyrannus could easily have gone either way. That is why the debate lasted so long. And that is why the Dueling Dinosaurs specimen matters so much. It did not just add another opinion. It added anatomy, completeness, and maturity evidence. It gave scientists a new way to ask whether the small tyrannosaur body plan was a temporary juvenile stage or a final adult form. If it was final, then Nanotyrannus was not a baby king. It was a different tyrant. A smaller tyrant, yes. A less famous tyrant, certainly, but a real one. And if that is true, then the last tyrannosaur world becomes more interesting than the myth of one king ruling alone. We can imagine T-Rex as the giant specialist, the heavy skull, the crushing bite, the animal that could process carcasses and attack large prey with overwhelming force. Nanotyrannus, by contrast, may have been built around a different balance. Lighter, more agile, with a narrower skull and different teeth. It may have pursued prey in ways an adult T-Rex did not. It may have competed with younger T-Rex rather than adult giants. It may have occupied the dangerous middle ground between small predators and the apex heavyweight. That middle ground matters. Ecosystems often have multiple predator sizes. Lions coexist with leopards, hyenas, cheetahs, wild dogs, and smaller carnivores, each with overlaps and differences. Ancient ecosystems were not flat, they were tiered. If late Cretaceous North America really had an adult medium-sized tyrannosaur alongside T-Rex, then the predator tiers were richer. It also raises a fascinating question. Why did this diversity survive so late? The end of the Cretaceous is often imagined as a world waiting for extinction. But dinosaurs did not know the asteroid was coming. They were not symbolic doomed creatures. They were living animals in functioning ecosystems. Hell Creek was not a dying stage set where T-Rex stood alone under a red sky. It was a living landscape. Rivers moved, plants grew. Animals nested, hunted, fought, scavenged, and died. Nanotyrannus, if valid, makes that world feel more alive. That is the emotional power of the debate. A taxonomic revision can resurrect complexity. Not resurrection in the literal sense, but in our imagination. It gives a lost ecosystem another actor. It makes the final dinosaur world less empty. It reminds us that extinction did not erase a simple picture. It erased a dense web of lives, many of which we are still only beginning to recognize. But we should also remember the limits. A complete skeleton is extraordinary, but science is built on replication, comparison, and continued testing. The Dueling Dinosaurs research is strong, but future studies will refine the picture. New specimens may clarify juvenile T-Rex anatomy. Additional histological work may confirm or challenge maturity estimates. More detailed comparisons may reveal how much variation existed within Nanotyrannus. Phylogenetic analyses may shift its placement. Some proposed Nanotyrannus specimens may be accepted. Others may be reassigned. That is not a flaw. That is the next chapter. Science does not end when a headline says, "Debate settled." It moves from broad controversy into finer questions. The old question was, is Nanotyrannus real? The new questions may be, how many Nanotyrannus specimens are real? How many species existed? Which fossils are juvenile T-Rex? How did Nanotyrannus grow? How did it hunt? How did it interact with T-Rex? Why did it evolve smaller body size in the shadow of the largest tyrannosaur? Did it live in different microhabitats? Was it common or rare? What does it reveal about the last few million years before the asteroid? Those are better questions. They are the reward for solving the first mystery. One of the most important lessons here is that paleontology is not just about discovering new fossils. It is also about rediscovering old fossils. The Cleveland skull sat in collections for decades. Jane was studied intensely. The Dueling Dinosaurs specimen was famous before it was fully scientifically accessible. A fossil does not reveal everything the moment it is found. It reveals what scientists are able to ask with the methods and comparisons available at the time. That is why museum collections matter. A specimen collected decades ago can become important again when new techniques appear. Histology, CT scanning, 3D modeling, comparative data sets, and new phylogenetic analyses can turn old bones into new evidence. The Nanotyrannus debate shows that the future of dinosaur science is not only buried in the ground. Some of it is already sitting in drawers, waiting for a better question. And the better question is not always the flashiest. Was it a baby T-Rex? Is flashy, but behind it is a deeper scientific problem. How does a giant predator become a giant predator? What changes during growth? How do juvenile and adult animals divide ecological roles? How does a predator community organize itself when one species becomes enormous? How do we distinguish ontogeny from diversity? Ontogeny is the development of an organism over its lifetime. In paleontology, ontogeny can be a trap. A juvenile may look like a separate species because it has not yet developed adult traits. An adult of a small species may look juvenile because it retains features that resemble young animals of larger relatives. Without growth data, paleontologists can mistake one for the other. That is exactly why skeletal maturity matters. If bones show that an animal has slowed or stopped growth, that changes the interpretation. If skeletal fusions indicate maturity, that matters. If a supposedly juvenile animal has mature bone texture, that matters. If a small specimen is still young and growing rapidly, that matters too. The goal is not to make a fossil fit a preferred story. The goal is to ask what stage of life it actually represents. Nanotyrannus forced paleontologists to take that question seriously. And because T-Rex is involved, everyone pays attention. That attention is a gift and a curse. It means research reaches the public. It means kids, teachers, filmmakers, museum visitors, and science fans care deeply. But it also means headlines simplify. Some will say Nanotyrannus confirmed, T-Rex theory destroyed. Others will say baby T-Rex debate finally over. Still others will turn it into a species war. Nanotyrannus versus T-Rex. The real story is better than a war. It is not Nanotyrannus versus T-Rex in the sense of one replacing the other. It is Nanotyrannus and T-Rex as a more complex shared world. It is paleontologists correcting the biography of both animals. It is the discovery that the King's Kingdom had another tyrant. Maybe that is why this debate feels so satisfying. It does not make T-Rex smaller, it makes the ecosystem larger. T-Rex remains one of the most extraordinary predators ever to live. Its body size, skull strength, sensory abilities, and cultural power are not diminished by Nanotyrannus. If anything, T-Rex becomes more interesting when surrounded by more real competition. A king with rivals tells a better story than a king alone in an empty landscape. And Nanotyrannus becomes more than trivia. It becomes a test of how we think. Can we let a less famous animal have its own identity? Can we update the story without turning science into cheap drama? Can we accept that a debate can be long, messy, and still productive? Can we admit that even the most famous dinosaur in the world still has surprises around it? There is another reason Nanotyrannus matters for public science. It teaches people how paleontologists actually argue. Popular culture often imagines paleontology as a sequence of discoveries. Someone finds a skeleton, names it, and the story is done. But the real work is more like an extended negotiation with uncertainty. A bone has shape, texture, size, and position. It has damage. It has missing parts. It has geological context. It may have been crushed by millions of years of pressure. It may come from a formation where many related animals lived close together. Scientists have to decide what counts as a meaningful difference and what counts as noise. That decision is not easy. Take tooth count. More teeth can be a taxonomic clue, but it can also vary within groups. Take limb proportions. Long arms may be important, but proportions change during growth. Take skull openings, sinuses, and nerve patterns. These can be deeply informative, but they require careful comparison. Take fusion in the skeleton. Fusion often suggests maturity, but not every bone fuses at the same pace in every dinosaur. No single character is perfect. The strength comes from consilience, different lines of evidence pointing in the same direction. That word matters. Consilience. A good case is not built on one flashy trait. It is built when anatomy, histology, growth stage, comparison with known juvenile T-Rex fossils, and ecological context all begin to fit together. That is why the Dueling Dinosaurs specimen is so important. It does not ask us to trust one odd skull feature. It gives researchers a body to test. If the animal has a mature growth record, distinctive anatomy, larger forelimbs than expected, more teeth, and features that do not easily transform into adult T-Rex, then the juvenile explanation becomes harder to maintain. Still, a careful documentary should not pretend that uncertainty has vanished from every corner. Some scientists may accept Nanotyrannus lencensis, but remain cautious about assigning Jane or other specimens to new species. Some may agree the Dueling Dinosaurs Tyrannosaur was not a teenage T-Rex, but still want more data on exactly how Nanotyrannus fits within Tyrannosaur evolution. Some may be convinced by the broad case, while disagreeing about details of body mass, ecology, or specimen referral. That is not contradiction. That is the normal next phase after a major result. The debate also shows why commercial fossils can become scientific bottlenecks. The Dueling Dinosaurs fossil was famous, long before it became a scientific turning point. Its dramatic preservation made it valuable to collectors, institutions, media, and the public. But until a specimen is accessible for study, prepared carefully, documented, and made available to researchers, its scientific value remains partly locked away. Fossils are not only objects of wonder, they are data. When a spectacular fossil sits outside research access for years, an entire debate can be slowed. That is why museum acquisition matters here. Once the specimen entered a public scientific institution, it could be studied in detail, compared with other tyrannosaurs, scanned, prepared, and placed into a broader research conversation. This is not just an administrative detail. It is the difference between a fossil as treasure and a fossil as evidence. The public gets the awe either way, but science needs the evidence. And the evidence from Nanotyrannus forces a subtler picture of T-Rex. If young T. Rex were not exactly the same as the animals once labeled Nanotyrannus, then we need to rebuild the growth story from fossils that are truly Tyrannosaurus. What did a real teenage T-Rex look like? How quickly did its skull deepen? When did its bite become truly bone-crushing? Did it hunt differently from adults? Did it compete with Nanotyrannus, avoid it, or dominate it? Did adult T-Rex prey on smaller tyrannosaurs? We do not know all of that yet, but the questions become sharper. In a way, Nanotyrannus gives T-Rex back its childhood by taking away a false one. That sounds paradoxical, but it is important. If some supposed juvenile T-Rex specimens were not Rex, then the true juvenile T-Rex record becomes smaller but cleaner. A cleaner sample may be less dramatic at first, but it helps scientists build better models. Bad data can make a confident story wrong. Better data may make the story more modest, but also more accurate. This is the deeper reason cheap headlines are dangerous. If the headline says everything about T-Rex was wrong, that is false. If the headline says Nanotyrannus proves T-Rex was not special, that is also false. The real story is more powerful. Paleontologists may have been using some wrong fossils to answer the right questions. Now they have a chance to ask those questions again with better sorting. That is how a small tyrannosaur changes the king. Not by knocking the crown off its head, but by forcing scientists to redraw the family album. The Dueling Dinosaurs fossil also carries one more kind of drama: the temptation to turn preservation into narrative. A triceratops and a tyrannosaur preserved together practically begs for a battle scene. It is easy to imagine claws, horns, dust, blood, and a final struggle frozen by time. Maybe something like that happened, maybe not. The association is extraordinary, but the exact events leading to burial are difficult to prove. A responsible documentary can enjoy the drama while admitting the uncertainty. That uncertainty is part of the beauty. Fossils are not movies. They are aftermaths. We arrive late, long after the sound is gone, and try to reconstruct the event from what remains. Sometimes the remains are dramatic enough to feel like a final frame. But the job of science is not to believe the most cinematic version because it feels satisfying. The job is to ask what the bones, sediment, posture, breakage, and context can actually support. That same discipline should guide the whole Nanotyrannus story. It is tempting to make the animal into an underdog hero, the small tyrant finally escaping the shadow of T-Rex. That framing is fun, and there is truth in it metaphorically. But the animal did not know it was in a taxonomic debate. It was not trying to prove paleontologists wrong. It was a predator living in a late Cretaceous ecosystem, hunting, growing, competing, and dying millions of years before humans invented names for it. The name matters to us. The life mattered to it. And maybe that is the most important perspective. Behind the controversy is a real animal. Not a headline, not a specimen number, not a rival brand to T-Rex. A living creature with muscle, hunger, fear, injuries, instincts, and a place in its world. If the recent evidence is right, the Nanotyrannus was not just an awkward stage in somebody else's life. It was itself. That may be the quiet emotional core of the debate. Science gave an animal back its identity. Not completely, Not finally, not beyond all future revision, but enough to make us look at the fossil differently. Enough to imagine a smaller tyrant moving through Hell Creek, not as an unfinished king, but as a finished predator. Enough to make the final age of dinosaurs feel less like a one-monster empire and more like a living ecosystem with multiple dangers. And that is why the debate will keep mattering. Because every dinosaur controversy, when handled well, teaches two things at once. It teaches us something about the ancient world, and it teaches us something about how we know anything at all. Nanotyrannus teaches that growth can imitate species, species can hide inside growth, famous animals can swallow the identities of smaller ones, and one extraordinary fossil can force decades of assumptions back onto the table. That is the real value of Nanotyrannus. It changed the king of dinosaurs not by defeating T-Rex, but by forcing us to look again. Look again at the bones. Look again at growth. Look again at the ecosystem. Look again at the assumptions hidden inside fame. For decades, a small tyrannosaur stood at the edge of the most famous predator's shadow. Some saw a juvenile, some saw a species. The answer took skulls, skeletons, growth rings, maturity indicators, and years of argument. And even now, the story is not finished. It has only become more precise. That is what good science does. It does not always give us simple closure. It gives us better uncertainty. And in this case, the better uncertainty is thrilling. Because somewhere in the last forests of the Cretaceous, beneath a sky that did not yet know an asteroid was coming, there may have been more than one kind of tyrant moving through the trees. The giant was there. Of course, T-Rex, the bone-crushing monarch, the animal whose name would one day become shorthand for prehistoric power. But perhaps there was also a smaller hunter, faster, lighter, mature in its own right, not a teenage king, but a different predator with its own story. For a long time, that story may have been swallowed by the fame of T-Rex. Now it is coming back out of the rock, not as a headline that humiliates the king, not as a cheap twist, but as a reminder that prehistoric life was never as simple as our icons make it seem. T-Rex was still the king, but maybe the king was not alone. And sometimes, in paleontology, that is the most exciting discovery of all.